Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us on tonight's Healing Circle with Dr. Janet Taylor. We are so excited to have her. I'm sure you guys are excited as well. Ms. Taylor, would like to take it?
Sure. Thank you so much. I'm always glad to be on with Dr. Merritt and certainly everything you do with Multicultural Health Institute. Want to talk about mental health and keep this pretty conversational. If anyone on the call has any questions, you can text them or raise your hand or certainly talk about what's going on. But I think it's important to start with everybody just taking a breath and settle in. You made it here on the call. Notice how you're feeling anything, what you're feeling. Let your breath go to any places there's you feel tense. And if you don't feel tense and you're feeling relaxed, and right on and keep doing that. But just a reminder of how important it is to always check in with not just what you're thinking, but how you're doing. A word about mental health. Often when we talk about mental health, we think about mental illness, and certainly mental illness is a component of mental health. And by mental illness, I mean any condition that interrupts your ability to function, whether that's at work, relationships, home, sleeping, eating. And we know that almost 50% of all Americans have a diagnosable mental condition, such as maybe including adjustment disorder, if you're reacting to something, or even grief, maybe people that have some anxiety, but certainly there are other conditions like a major depression, bipolar disorder, schizoaffective, paranoid disorder, things like that, which, get more into the disorders that certainly require treatment. But the point of this is if anyone is having any kind of mental health issue where they think that they need help, to really understand where you can get it, whether it's in your local county or a clinic, talking to your primary care director, because there's never been, in my opinion, a more important time to think about mental wellness and certainly mental health. Our brain is 3% of our body weight, utilizes 25% of our blood glucose and oxygen. So whatever we put into our mouths, our brain is the first organ that is a recipient of whatever we eat or drink. When we work out, we get blood flow and nourishment to our brain, which is extremely important because in this day and age where so many people report feeling anxious and stressed, when we have a healthy brain, then it can allow us to take what feels like challenges, to take those obstacles and use our brain to help us reframe it in a way that, we can make a decision that allows us to move on to the next thing that we need to, hopefully not beat ourselves up too much, give ourselves some grace and reflect on what we've learned in the past so that we can move forward in a way that allows us to really enjoy our lives, as complicated as they may be. So, one important point to continue to think about is, what is mental wellness and how can we have a brain and certainly a life that contributes to that? As I mentioned, exercise is important, diet's important, positive thinking is important. Things like meditation, yoga, all those aspects that allow us to really change our brain, we can do. Our brain has over 90 billion neurons, almost a trillion connections that it makes. And, a fun fact, we have more neurons in our gut than we do in our actual brain. But that brain gut connection is strong, which is why when things may be bothering you, you feel them so deeply sometimes in your gut or your stomach. So know that it is our brain that allows every organ in our body to function, and we really have to protect it. With that, I don't know if there's any questions or any comments. If anybody on the call wants to check in, like how are you feeling today, and what ways do you take care of your mental wellness? Anyone want to come off mute and speak? Okay.
Oh, I will.
Okay.
Um, so I feel like I've always tried to be mindful of this, especially when I'm working. Sometimes I am able to work from home, but I recognize even from back when I was in grad school, I would get very anxious. And so, in order to try and keep anxiety at bay for me, I know exercise is helpful, but sometimes I just get too bogged down in the work that I'm doing. So I try to play calming music and also aromatherapy is very helpful for me. So I usually try to find a candle and either play like pink noise or brown noise or whatever R&B playlist to help me like regulate how I'm feeling and also get in the zone because I know that if I'm sensing that I'm becoming anxious, then I kind of will just spiral versus, use that same energy to lock in on what I'm supposed to be doing.
Well, thank you. I mean, you touched on a lot of things, and I appreciate you stepping up to say that. Number one, anxiety. What is anxiety? Anxiety is a feeling. It's usually a symptom of something and can be really characterized by maybe your stomach's upset, maybe your heart beats, maybe you have a headache, maybe you just like have nerves that you don't know where they're coming from. And an important aspect of anxiety is that there are medical conditions that can cause anxiety. There are medications that can cause anxiety. So when you have anxiety, one of the first things you want to do, certainly if, hopefully you have some resources and go in for healthcare, but get a physical and get your thyroid checked and look at the medications you're on, look at how much you're eating, sleeping, what you're drinking, too much caffeine, all of those other factors. Look at issues that are going on in your life, because sometimes, depending on what you're doing, that feeling anxiety may be a normal reaction to something that may be important to you, or maybe, really saying to your body, like, I need to pay attention to this. So look at anxiety as a symptom. Secondly, explore it with the doctor or healthcare provider. Know that it's treated. It can be treated through medication. It can be treated through therapy. And as Monique said, you can also use know yourself. That's where self-awareness is so important, and use different things that can calm you down. Sometimes it's deep breathing, sometimes it's meditation, or listening to music, or putting on different kinds of noise. So what you really illustrated, Monique, is the fact that, all of us may get nervous at times or have some anxiety. And it's important to recognize maybe what triggers it and to investigate what's going on, like literally asking yourself, like, what's going on with me, in an attempt to figure out how to mitigate it. One thing about our brain does not like uncertainty. So when we're in a situation that we don't know what's going to happen next, our brain will take us on this roller coaster ride that really can be worst case scenario without the evidence. So when you recognize that maybe that's, where you're thinking that's how it's going, which typically may happen just as about when you're about to go to sleep, or, as you mentioned, maybe when you go to work or come home from work, one thing that you can do is just literally stop yourself, by taking some deep breaths, looking at the problem and finding ways that are knowable in the sense of, if you're worried about your finances, actually looking at how much money you have, or where the bills are, or if it's a relationship, actually talking to your partner. If you're worried about work performance, talking about it to help settle your brain down. So you take it out of that uncertainty to something that even if it may not be news that you want, it still helps our brain. So you have anxiety. We also have something called panic attacks, panic disorder, which may not be in response to something that's been done, triggered in that way, but just come out of the blue. And you may feel like you're having a heart attack, your chest gets tight, you can't breathe, maybe breathing too quickly. And so panic disorder is also something that is treatable. And the same thing that you do for anxiety in terms of, getting a physical, looking at your meds, looking at your diet, how much sleep, and all those factors, getting help. What we don't want to do is have a stigma against people who may have anxiety, depression, or any mental condition, but recognize that our brain is a medical organ. And so when we have issues like depression or anxiety, it's really a brain-based disorder, even substance abuse. And so we want to be mindful of what we say. When people may say that they're feeling a certain way, and not label them or make them feel worse or guilty, and find ways to support them. So thanks for that.
Interesting. I have a question then, because I know for a lot of the audience that typically interact with our healing circle, they are either usually like 55 or older, and they are oftentimes caretakers. So can you speak to, I guess, maybe how they may either observe and can help family members that they may be caring for, let's say like their parents, more than likely their parents that they're caring for that may be exhibiting these things, or even how they can help to identify these feelings within themselves? Because I think that older generation, don't have the words and the awareness, at least not of self. Maybe they're aware these things exist now, but applying it to themselves and how that could be helpful for them.
Yeah, no, thank you for bringing that up. I mean, thank you as caregivers, to all of you who are doing that. It could be your parents, it could be your partner, it could be a sick child, or some other family member. So thank you for doing that. We know that women have the highest likelihood of being unpaid caregivers. And when you are a caregiver, you are more likely to be depressed or anxious because you're doing in some cases double or triple duty. So as a caregiver, often you will not go to your own doctor's appointments or take care of yourself because you're taking care of someone else. In addition, as caregivers, we know that people who are caregivers end up spending a lot of money out of pocket, pay for medications, maybe pay for other bills. So it can be a very stressful time. So my advice to caregivers, number one, is to prioritize yourself and make sure that you do not forego your own doctor's appointments or your own mental and physical health as you were taking care of someone else, which may be easier said than done. I understand that. But often as caregivers, sometimes we don't want to raise our hand and say we need help. So when people offer to help, maybe sit, with your loved one while you go to the doctor or sit with your loved one or come do something, sometimes you have to give that up and let them do it. People may come in your home, maybe siblings, other people who may not do the same job that you do or do it like you would do it, but understand that as caregivers, you still need that break. So, what to look for if you are afraid that as a caregiver, you may be depressed or have anxiety yourself, or the person you're caring for might do that. We know that chronic illness can increase the risk of being depressed or having anxiety because it really takes a lot of energy. Sometimes people aren't sure what's happening to them. You can't do what you used to do, or you may feel like you're a burden. And all of those can certainly contribute as a risk factor to depression. Certainly, if you have a past history of depression or family members that may have depression, that's another thing. So, all of us may get sad when you have a depression. It's a depressed mood that lasts for 2 weeks or longer, where you may feel helpless or hopeless and lose interest in what you normally do. You may oversleep or undersleep, undereat or overeat. But typically, it's characterized by a depressed mood and feeling helpless and hopeless and like there's just no point. So that's something to look for in yourself as a caregiver, and certainly something to look for in other people. As I mentioned earlier, medications can sometimes make people feel anxious. So looking at the meds that you're on, and overall, really it's important as a caregiver just to check in with yourself. Like, how am I doing? What do I need? What am I denying for myself? And really making a pact to not feel guilty by putting yourself first. So asking for help, making sure you keep your doctor's appointments, and then if you do feel depressed or anxious longer than 2 weeks, making sure that you go in and see your doctor. But as caregivers, certainly you're at risk for not only financial strain, but emotional strain as well, because often you're caring for your loved one and worried about them. So it's really, really critical that caregivers take good care of themselves. Thanks for that question. Any other questions about your mental health, or anybody just want to check in and say how they're doing? Come off mute. Like, how are you doing, feeling during this time? Okay. Well, at any point, if you do, again, raise your hand or come off mute and just ask a question, or certainly feel free to type it into the chat. So one of the reasons that so many people who have chronic medical problems are caregivers, or just, maybe feeling overwhelmed in general, while they notice a change in how they're feeling, is because of the stress response in the body. And as I mentioned, the brain, in my opinion, is really our most important ally, because it can allow us to take a realistic look at what's really happening in our lives, but also make decisions that can help alleviate whatever we're feeling. And so as you're listening to me speak, your brain is, hearing the sound of my voice, maybe hearing other things in the background, seeing things, smelling things, all that, our brain never shuts off. And so, our brain is basically here for our survival. So unconsciously, your brain is assessing whether it's safe for you to sit wherever you are or stand wherever you are, wherever you're listening to this or watching this, or do you need to run? And so in that regard, if something did happen, heaven forbid, like, some alligator jump through your window or something, then your brain would be ready to respond and tell you danger, danger, and you would go to a safe place. Unfortunately, our brain, our eyes can certainly see something like that, but to so many of us, there may be psychological things that are going on, this crisis around us where, inflation, or, you may be an immigrant, or know people who are, or, have heard some bad news. There's always something going on. And to our brain, you might assess that as a threat. Every word that somebody says to you, every sentence somebody says to you, your brain is assessing whether it's a reward or a threat. So as a regard, that stress response pretty much is on all the time. And so the key is when you're feeling good and you know you're safe, is really to take deep breaths and have gratitude for that and be thankful about that. But on the other hand, if you know that you have chronic stressors, you're worried about finances or how are you going to pay for this or something's going on, to also be good to yourself and your brain by thinking about it, maybe talking to somebody about it, by working out, trying to get a good night's sleep. Because the way the stress response works is when our brain feels a threat, and again, it could be an actual threat like an alligator trying to jump through your window, or the threat of just being brown in America right now, frankly, or a woman, in America could feel like a threat to you. So your brain will signal to every organ in your body that fight or flight response. And when you're in the middle of battle, then you need it on. So when you're in the middle of battle, then you release fibrinogen into your bloodstream, which helps your blood clot, but can also lead to heart attacks or strokes, if you're chronically stressed. You release blood glucose and cholesterol into your bloodstream because in the middle of a battle, you need energy. So you do all that. It turns off estrogen and testosterone because the last thing you're thinking about in the heat of the battle is reproducing. It can lead to anxiety and depression and also impact your immune system. We know that chronic stress can impact cellularly, so increase the risk of, autoimmune disorders or even cancers. And so it's not to say that, we should not be stressed, because if you're a human and living life, there are times you're going to be stressed. But what it really speaks to is the need for recovery, and especially if you're in a stressful situation as a caregiver, or maybe you have a stressful job. It means those times when you can really tune out and tune into yourself and get some balance and let your brain get back to normal, let your body get back to normal. It's really important. Most of us are chronically stressed 24/7, which means if we already have a medical condition like diabetes or high blood pressure, we can make it worse. If you have cancer or have had a stroke, having a positive attitude can really help in your healing. So it's really important that you recognize it at a level that unconsciously your brain is always is working. So what do you need to do on a regular basis to practice so that you can have good brain health and really maximize this gift that we have, which is, a healthy brain that can allow us to make decisions and decide, whether we're going to go down a rabbit hole of worst case scenarios, or are we going to have an attitude of gratitude and compassion for ourselves and other people. So, in my opinion, our brain is our biggest ally. We totally underutilize it. Most people don't even know how our brain works. But if you look throughout history, it's been our brain, the brain of people who, like Fannie Lou Hamer, who, took herself and got, the Mississippi Democratic Party to vote. Harriet Tubman, who led people, over 100 formerly enslaved people, to freedom, like one person. Martin Luther King, one person who used their brain, definitely tapped into fear, but used it more for courage because they stood up to what was right, which speaks to the importance of knowing what we value, what's meaningful to us, having a sense of purpose as it helps us navigate, day to day. And those are all things that our brain can do and can help us, certainly lead a life that we want to and make decisions that will help us. Questions?
Can you talk a little bit about the the effect of deep breathing and how breathing can be helpful in this process of de-stressing ourselves? Because I think it's something that we hear a lot about, but I think
Keep going.
people just really need to understand what the whole process is that happens in your body with that.
Yes, thank you so much. It's a great question. So, how does deep breathing help us in the long run and the short run? When we, use self awareness to recognize that we may be feeling stressed or something's going on, taking a deep breath is key. There's things like a 4x4. You can take deep inhalation 4 in, hold it for 4 and exhale out for 4. You do it 4 times, it can totally de-stress you. But one of the reasons that inhaling in deeply helps is that as we expand our lungs, our lungs and heart are right there together. As we expand our lungs by inhaling in, we ever so gently press on our vagal nerve, and the vagal nerve innervates our heart. And so as we are doing that, it ever so minutely slows down our heart rate. So that sense of calm that you feel, when your blood pressure may go down, is real by doing that. And in addition, people who meditate on a regular basis, or, whether that's a walking meditation, or whether that's mantras, or, practicing yoga or deep breathing, you can actually change your brain and lessen it, how easily you may get stressed by that practice. And for some people, when you have a mantra like relax, or a mantra like it's going to be okay, coupled with deep breathing, you can actually feel yourself calm down. So that's why it's called a practice, because the more you practice it, then it becomes almost automatic and like a habit. But that there's a real sensation of feeling relaxed because of the deep inhalation that can ever so gently slow down your respirations. In addition, when we're anxious and we're breathing rapidly, then we are breathing out oxygen, and so it can, kind of fool our body into feeling that we are more anxious or more in danger than we actually are. So when I talk about the our brain as an ally, and really using, this gift that we have of our brain and body to essentially heal ourselves, or certainly to attend to ourselves, that practice and knowing that go to in terms of how to relax yourself is really, really important. So often people feel like, to practice meditation or do deep breathing, you have to go to a spa, or, be out in the middle of, Bali or somewhere. And the beauty of that is, I lived in New York City for 25 years. The beauty of that is you could be on the subway, you can be in the midst of a crowd of people, and, consciously take slow, long, deep breaths in and out and relax yourself. And a really good way to do that is to practice. You can either write it down and say, okay, for 5 minutes or even less than a minute, I'm going to practice that. But you really get used to taking care of yourself. And our breath is the breath of life. It's a gift, but we totally underutilize ways to soothe ourselves. Another good technique, if you're feeling stressed or anxious, is just to look around and utilize our senses, because our senses can help our brain slow down. So think about what you're feeling, what you're seeing, what you're tasting, what you're hearing, like utilizing your senses, and like saying them to yourself out loud, or just at least to yourself. And then also saying things like, now I see a lamp, now I see a tree, looking at things that you see, and focusing on relaxing yourself. But we have the power to do that. And once you recognize that, it's really a tool that's invaluable. In addition, there are a couple websites that you can go to, like Insight, or apps. Insight Timer, it's free. They have 5 minute, 30-minute, hour meditations that you can use, things like Calm and Headspace, that are really great tools to help you relax. So did that answer your question? Okay, good. Thanks for the question. Anybody else have comments, questions, thoughts? Okay. So we talked about anxiety, talked about depression, how to relax yourselves. And now I just think it's important that we focus on understanding how the context of history is important as it relates to our mental health. Certainly in medicine, there's a long history of bias and racism in medicine that, not only existed, but still persist. And so it impacts mental health as well. For instance, to justify slavery or racialized capitalism, there are a number of scientists who did pseudoscience and myths about Black people being inferior, Native Americans being inferior, in an attempt to justify their treatment, or why they couldn't contain their be on their own land, or why they needed to be enslaved for African Americans. And we know that that's not true, but some of that pseudoscience has persisted. In fact, there are a couple of things like drapetomania that said a freed man or woman was more likely to be psychotic and depressed than a slave. Facts that we have a higher pain tolerance. So in some cases, even when I was in med school, they were teaching that Black people didn't get depressed. And that's just not true. But as a result, if you are a person of color, and in particular a woman, we know that on average it takes Black women 10 times presenting to their primary care doctor, 10 times before they're even asked how they are feeling. And so it's really up to us when we are in, with our healthcare provider, no matter who they are, man, woman, they could even be the same ethnicity as you, that you really are prepared to talk about, not only what symptom you have, but how you are doing and feeling as it relates to your mental health. And learn how to advocate for yourself and being determined not to leave that doctor's office or, get off telehealth if that's what you're on until your issues are addressed. So what does that mean? That means if you notice symptoms or have some concerns, write them down if you can't remember them. Some people get anxious, when they're talking to healthcare providers. If there's someone you trust and you give the okay for them to be in there with you, they may even be able to advocate for you. But it's really critical that we understand how the brain and body works. And, a healthy brain is a healthy body. The World Health Organization says there's no physical health without mental health. So being able to advocate for yourself, recognizing when maybe, your mood may be down or you're not as optimistic and certainly don't have energy. And again, it persists 2 weeks or longer or interferes with your daily function, that you are able to ask those questions to get the help that you need. And so writing things down, inform yourself, not that you have to go on Dr. Google for everything. And if you do go on the internet, certainly you want to go on reputable sources like Mayo Clinic or WebMD, something like that. But understand that our brain can impact totally how we feel physically, what our outlook on life is. And thankfully now we have a lot more medications, there's psychotherapy, there's talk therapy that can help you get back to where you were. You do not have to suffer alone. You should not have a stigma about anything. And certainly, your own mental and physical health is your business, that you should not be ashamed of talking to your healthcare provider about. Any other questions? Um, so, so again, there's a history of racism in medicine. But also, when I look at history too, I think about the mental resilience and the strength that so many women and men had that helped them get through tough times. And in particular, I've been doing a lot of research about the Maroons. The Maroons were formerly enslaved people who would escape, this horrible, horrible situations by going to places that their masters, could not get to. So they'd escape to the mountains in Jamaica. There's Nanny Queen Annie the Maroons. In Florida, there was something called this Great Low Dismal Swamp that extended from Florida to the Carolinas, where formerly enslaved people would go to escape other people. And almost every country where there are enslaved people had that. And so looking at what it took for them to have that sense when everything was against them, laws were against them physically, they could be killed for running away, doing all these things, that they would still go. Well, number one, they had their brain. And what their brain told them was that you have everything you need. They had faith, and not to say that, not, which is different from religion, organized religion, but a spirituality, meaning that they always had a sense of hope because they had a higher power that was looking out for them. They refused to succumb to, social issues in terms of racism or lack of expectations that people put up on them. They really care for humanity. And so what they did was not just for themselves, but how do we help other people? How do we help, our community? They always looked at that. And they also knew the power of connection. And when you think about things that people are going through now, those same things apply. Like, how can you see a future that's greater than yourselves? And I would argue we need to be able to do that. How do we not look so far backwards of things that we couldn't do anything about, that we get stuck in the past? How do we reach out and realize what, our resources are? Certainly, COVID-19 has taught us that social isolation and loneliness are huge risk factors, not only for depression and anxiety, but also can worsen other medical illnesses because it's extremely stressful when you're chronically lonely or socially isolated. How do we have a Teflon really so that we don't allow what other people think about us based on how we look, the texture of our hair, the color of our skin, our gender? How do we not let that impact us to keep us still moving ahead? And then, this sense of purpose and a sense of meaning. which means we have to think about it and reflect on it. Values, like what's important to you, even when it seems like it's not as important to the rest of the world. And then lastly, like this sense that, there is a higher power who is looking out for you and always there. And so when, you're taking the steps that you're taking, that you're not alone in that. And so to me, it's really powerful to look at how, formerly enslaved people all around the world, at those times, or those 1800s, fighting for civil rights, later in the 60s or after Emancipation Proclamation, like what they did to keep themselves going. And I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned there that really speak to a sense of resistance, in the sense of they didn't succumb to, what the world or what their county or what their neighbors would say about them, because they felt like, their goals were bigger. And, that is formulated in our brain. It helps us to really modulate the stress response so that we don't become incapacitated, but in fact realize our strength. And so when we talk about the stress response too, there's something in our brain called the amygdala, which is known as the brain's fear factor, that really where all the senses, everything you're taking in, like the amygdala can certainly trigger the stress response. But what so many people don't realize is in the amygdala can not only, turn on fear response, but also can increase courage. So when I say that our brain really contains so much of what we need, it certainly starts there. And we also know within the brain, hope and power are, there are places in the brain where hope and power are, and they go together. And that is always there. So when we talk about us having everything we need, I'm not talking about if you want like a new purse or a new car, but everything that we need to help us keep going, to help us make sense of things that seem nonsensical, that, allow us to have to prioritize ourselves, we certainly have. And so, it comes with reflection, it comes with self-awareness. If you find that you're unable to do those things for yourself, then, maybe you should find a therapist or, a counselor, or a social worker or someone to talk to so that you really can shore up yourself around that. So how do you find a therapist? Certainly, there are more mental health needs than ever, and sometimes it can be difficult. But I'd say one of the first things to do is, talk to your primary care provider. If you were underinsured or uninsured, know that, every county has places you can go for physicals and things like that. Certainly, Multicultural Health Institute is one of those places. Hi, Dr. Merritt. It's nice to see you. I work for Centerstone, where we see people who are underinsured or uninsured, but those places are always there. So find someone to talk to. They don't have to look like you. They just need to be competent and, a good fit. And go and get the help that you need. Thoughts, questions, comments?
Well, I just want to thank you for giving of your time, Dr. Taylor. It just brings such a great light to us in this month of July, which is also Minority Mental Health Awareness Month. And the fact that we should and can talk about these things, and that we get further along if we do than if we don't. I just literally spent time with a lady whose blood pressure was through the roof, and they wanted to add more blood pressure medicine. And I just talked with her and found out she was upset because she was in the rehab unit and she's missing her daughter's funeral.
Oh,
Mind and the body are so connected.
yeah.
And she's also worried about some other things with her health, obviously. But we did some deep breathing. We talked about her frustration and her feeling like I'm missing out and these kind of things. And I said, I really don't want to give you more pressure. Let's talk about how you handle this stress and this frustration, and how we can work with that and translate that into exercise and other things. And sure enough, her pressure did come down and we didn't have to give her more medication. So, and if you could talk a little bit, about that, the power of the mind and the body, and that it's kind of a decompression of holding grief and anger and all of these things, how that can translate into the body and affect your blood sugar and your blood pressure and your pain and sleep and all of those things that are important for your function.
Yeah. Well, thanks for everything you do, Dr. Merritt. And your patient was lucky to have you talk to her, because what happens sometimes too is when somebody has a symptom, we'll just keep adding meds and not getting to the core issue, right? And so there's a lot of things that you said, but number one is like there's a notion of what's sacred and secret. In my opinion, things that have happened to you that make you feel bad that we keep as secrets because of guilt and shame, we need to blurt out and get rid of. And what we want to hold on to is what's sacred, what makes us feel better, because we know that grief and pain and how you feel, it lands and lives in our bodies. And when you have that tightness from something that's happened, or you're constantly thinking about something, it recruits muscles all around, so it can really make things worse. But what you're talking about truly is how, the stress response, again, and, I mentioned earlier, it can be in response to something that's real, like a real threat, like some masked intruder, heaven forbid, that may be coming in, but also a thought or an experience can trigger the brain to go into the stress response. And, what is so damaging is when you're constantly stressed, our bodies were not meant to be on and stressed 24/7. We need those periods of recovery that only happen by, having a calm mind or finding some peace, or if you can exercise, or, simply turn off the TV and just, do nothing. All of those factors certainly can help us, because when you're chronically stressed or have depression, it can make pain worse, which is kind of, counterintuitive, because the pain can lead to anxiety, depression, and then it just becomes this vicious cycle, but certainly can worsen everything. And as I mentioned earlier, when you are chronically stressed and your body's in that fight or flight mode, when you're in fight mode, you're releasing blood glucose and cholesterol into your bloodstream because you need energy to fight. Your blood pressure goes up because your heart is beating faster, releasing fibrinogen to make your blood clot, which can lead to a risk of cardiovascular disease and strokes and all of those factors. Your immune system can shut down or go out of whack. Certainly, you're more anxious and depressed. So it worsens everything. So it's really, really important that multiple times a day, you check in with yourself and say, like, literally, body, how am I doing? And not just what you're thinking, but like notice where you're feeling sensations in the body. Hopefully, you're of a certain age where you recognize what you need to do, how you need to cope in a way that's good for you, which speaks about positive coping versus negative coping. Positive coping is when you like literally look at yourself with some reality and say, I'm feeling this because of that. And then do something about it in a way that, could be exercise, watching your diet, talking to somebody. And that's more positive coping, getting enough sleep, recognizing that when we're stressed, we crave foods that are sweet and salty. So if you're in the middle of studying for something or something's really stressful, anticipating that and having snacks that are healthy. On the other hand, negative coping can be, when you've had a hard day, and if you're a caregiver or a mom or a dad, you've gotten the kids in bed, so you reward yourself with alcohol or reward yourself with something sweet and sugary and all those things. That can become a habit. And those habits can lead to addictions, and those addictions, because our brain can become addicted to anything, literally anything, can lead to other factors. And if you're not getting enough sleep, or you're drinking all those caffeine drinks to stay awake, when in reality is you're not sleeping, like looking at that and asking yourself, am I coping in a way that's going to be healthy, or am I coping in a negative way? And if you have a hard time figuring that out, then we have to, again, lose the stigma and our pride and go and talk to somebody, a professional, about what it is you're feeling and doing. And that person doesn't have to be a psychiatrist. It could be a social worker, it could be your primary care doctor, it could be, a nurse practitioner, but just someone, preferably not your friends, because your friends are not necessarily therapists. Hopefully they're well-meaning, but you need someplace you can go and talk where you leave it there. And, there's confidentiality. The only time it wouldn't be is if you were going to hurt yourself or someone else, but you really are taking care of, your total self, your brain included. So thanks for that question, Dr. Merritt. Any other questions?
So, Dr. Taylor, I know you touched base on a lot of things that we could all be doing, but what is one specific next step we can take tonight to, better support our mental health?
Yeah. I'll give you two. Thanks for that. Number one is to think about your sleep hygiene and how you are sleeping. I can't say enough about sleep. Certainly, the older we get, the harder it is to sleep. And if you find that you're only sleeping 3 hours, 4 hours a night, when you wake up, the best thing that you can do, if you have to go to the bathroom and come back, not turn on the TV, not pick up a book, not look at your phone, do all those things to try to get back to sleep. And also, if you're someone who really is a poor sleeper, to try to catch up during the day if you have an opportunity to do that, and also check in with your healthcare provider to make sure you don't have sleep apnea. And looking at how much caffeine you drink, you should not, if you're having trouble sleeping, you should not drink coffee after 10 a.m. And certainly reading the labels and understanding there are a lot of drinks, that have caffeine in them, and really avoiding those. So number one, pay attention to your sleep hygiene. But number two, one of the things you can do tonight is write down 3 things that you are grateful for, because we know that having an attitude of gratitude and gratitude plays a big part in our overall well-being. And that's something that, all of us need to practice, is just like, even when things are hard, like, what am I grateful for? So those are 2 things that folks can do today.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for the question.
Of course. If no one else has a question, I have another one.
Okay.
So, what is a common myth or a misunderstanding for people of color pertaining to their mental health
Yeah.
or minorities?
I think, well, one common myth is that we won't go and talk to someone. And that's not true. More and more women, more and more men who historically have said, black men will not go see a therapist. That's not true. So that's a pretty common myth, that we won't get psychological treatment because we're getting it. The other is that if you are a visible minority or an ethnic minority, that you have to have someone who looks like you as a therapist. Again, that's not true. If you recognize that there is something weighing on you and you need to talk about it, or someone in your family may have a mental health history or something going on, like, find somebody to assess them and find somebody to see what's going on so they can get treatment. The other, as I mentioned earlier, is, this long history of racism and bias in medicine. And there was a thought that black people we didn't get depressed, like we could withstand everything. We're so resilient, we're so strong. And there are some people, especially black women, who feel like, we have to be superwomen. We can't complain. We can't ask for help. And that's not true either, because when you look at the statistics, especially things like preterm birth weight and infant mortality, black women across the board have the highest incident of infant mortality and low birth weight. And that's independent of socioeconomic status. So it's not that you have to be an urban woman who's under-resourced, or a rural, black woman who's under-resourced, and you're more at risk to have a baby that may die at birth, or have a low birth weight. What has been found, Weathering, Arlene Geronimus, a sociologist, has found that it's the impact of exposure to chronic racism that can prime the body. There's a hormone in the cervix that helps keep it closed, and it impacts that at the cellular level. So the reality is, chronic racism, not only triggers a stress response, but impacts us at the cellular level. So what does that mean? That means that, no matter who you are, I mean, Serena Williams had, pregnancy complications. No matter who you are, if you're a black woman and exposed to, racism, then you are at risk for yourself and your unborn child. There's also something called epigenetics that looks at how environmental factors, we know about genetic factors. If someone in your family may have depression or schizophrenia or some other medical condition, it can increase the likelihood that you may get it. Doesn't mean you will. But epigenetics, exposure to pesticides, pollution, chronic abuse, trauma, all those factors can impact us at the cellular level. And we know that women who are pregnant and in abusive relationships can prime their fetus's brain so that at a lower level, they're more likely to have depression or anxiety, which speaks to what we need to do to eliminate trauma in people's lives. How can we be more compassionate? How can we not deliberately, incarcerate people or put people in boxes or hunt them down and do all these things that, we're doing right now that are increasing fear and trauma and stress in folks, because it impacts them, and it impacts, their livelihood and the lives of their children, and certainly unborn children. So, mental health and overall well-being are connected. It's really important. And we have to think about, what we can do to have a better humanity, and what we can do in those day-to-day interactions that certainly don't make people's lives more difficult. But it's a great question. I think the other thing too, my practice, I run a clinic for people addicted to opiates and alcohol, and it was widely thought that this opiate crisis that we're in was largely whitewashed in the sense of, it's thought that it was mostly white people who were addicted to opiates. And I can tell you, like Black people are using opiates, Black teenagers, Black adults are using opiates as well. And, if we don't ask the right questions or do the right tests, we may miss it. But the reality is, any drug can be used to change how you're feeling, to use, to be self-medicate, to be abused in some cases. And so, we have to, that's why it's important to, for healthcare providers to really have an evidence-based approach to how they treat people in the office so that we ask the right questions, we ask the same questions and don't make assumptions based on, the color of somebody's skin or their socioeconomic background and don't do our due diligence. And that gets in the way too.
Thank you. And then my last question, this might sound like a ramble, but
Yeah.
um, so how could we, I guess, express to our community that it is good to go and talk with someone else, go to therapy and help them feel comfortable with the ugly questions or maybe with the questions that they don't even know they should be asking. And what questions would that look like? Like what?
Yeah, so there have definitely been campaigns to do that, and my personal opinion is we have to get out of our offices and go to where people are. Number one, so we can't expect somebody to just we have to sit in our office and wait for people to come. So going to we know where people are vulnerable, and talking to them, and helping them understand what we do. We have to make things like take away economic barriers, like be able. It's not enough to have a health fair and do depression screening. You tell somebody, yeah, you may be depressed, but then they can't get into a clinic. So how do we make sure that there's that continuity between when we're identifying something and they can actually get treatment or get medications? Fortunately, at younger ages, I think we're teaching about mindfulness and the benefit of that. There's a lot of research shows even 10 minutes a week of mindfulness can help elementary school kids simmer down during the day and do their work and feel better about themselves. So I think in earlier ages we're teaching kids about emotions. Emotions are not bad, in fact they're good. They can inform you about what you do need to do next. So looking at those big emotions and having them express that, and I think in many ways, we're helping with that. But at the same time, our kids are spending more time on their devices, less time with us face to face. And that we know that the more time anybody, but certainly a child spends on a device, then they're more likely to be depressed and anxious. So we still have work to do, but I think, looking at different ages and across the range, understanding that there are ways to talk about mental health in a positive way and help people understand what it is they need to do. We also know for teenagers that even if they could text and do telehealth with a therapist, it still can help them identify what if they're suicidal and doing all those other things. So I really think we to do a better job of meeting people where they are. We need more funding and more grants so that people can get the mental health treatment that they need, and more campaigns, whether it's barbershops or churches or schools where people at risk, and just go out and say like, this is your brain, this is how it works, what do you need? And teach them how to feel more confident about asking about what they need and what they expect. But the reality is, we know from ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences, which again is across socioeconomic status, that 85% of our kids between the ages of 5 and 18 have at least one adverse childhood experience, which may be divorce or separation or bullying, but at least 50% have three or more, which really puts them at higher risk for depression and trauma. And we just have to do a better job of, really being a communal safety net to protect the brains of our children and teenagers, and also teach them about mental health and steps that they can do.
That's so critical what you're raising. I mean, there's a lot of research coming more and more, especially in the age of misinformation and AI, and where they're making connections. And not using it as a tool, but using it as an answer. And there could be hallucinations and manipulation and the lack of social cohesion. I think you said another important thing, and that is helping people to identify their feelings. Another clinical experience today was a lady was upset. She was just like upset. And I was like, okay, so like, let's break this out. Like, are you sad? Are you mad? Are you angry? Are you frustrated? Are you scared? Let's try to identify what are your feelings? And she jumped on that framework. She was able to use that help say what she was sad about, what she was mad about.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes we're just so overwhelmed that helping people to break it out and then to understand, what's like working or not working for them, or what can immediately be dealt with, and what your action plan. That's kind of what
Mm-hmm.
our caregivers, navigators do, and helping people in crisis and helping get to resources, because people are so overwhelmed with these basic life issues, getting their electric bills paid, keeping the air conditioning going when it's 1,000 degrees outside, having enough food for these kind of things. And that's part of why we have the caregiver tracker manual that we've developed to help people to
Mm-hmm.
stay organized and not get overwhelmed. So I think that's
Mm-hmm.
another thing too. This so much information coming in and such a sense of having to do so many things. People get totally overwhelmed, and that goes into vulnerabilities, whether that's anxiety,
Yeah.
or sleep problems, or stomach problems, or whatever. And I'd love if you can talk a little bit about the effect of disconnection in society.
Mm-hmm.
Like how in other societies that maybe have lower resources, they actually have lower rates of depression,
Yep.
blood pressure problems, chronic diseases, and stress-related things because of the whole idea of social cohesion versus what's
Oh,
going
yeah.
on in our society and in our community in particular.
Yeah. No, I mean, if you look at like even the blue zones where people live the longest, 100, 105, as people get older, they value them. They listen to their stories, and that connection is always there. So it's not a matter if you get to be a certain age and what nursing home or assisted living you're going to go to, like you're going to be at home. And even in places like India where they're don't have psychiatric hospitals. People take care in Africa. They take care of their folks who may be mentally ill at home, and they do better, number one. So that connection is really key, because when we are born as infants and dependent upon our tribe, so to speak, to take care of us, like that connection, those bonds are built, and that doesn't go away. So having that sense of connection is one that we need. And so on the other hand, that disconnection, I think, again, COVID-19 really taught us, and many people still are feeling the effects, especially young people, of COVID-19, where, they were taken out of school. They didn't learn how to socially interact, how to socially bond, how to respond. They're afraid of conflict. Like they can't handle conflict. Like all those skills that we learned, if you're a certain age from being in school or having it interact, all those things are there. And so what happens to the brain, like all of those things increase the stress response. And that stress response can worsen every medical problem, create medical problems. So if nothing else, like it's really important that you find time to be around other people. We know that when you're around groups, there's oxytocin that is a natural hormone for bonding that's released. And so all of those factors are important and speak to just the critical nature of connection, which is why even like having these calls, or, what you do at the Multicultural Health Institute and getting people together. People know it's not just them. They know they're not alone. They learn resources. And a really critical point is that when you learn something that helps you and it's positive, like tell other people about it, invite other people. And so that people aren't as lonely and have somewhere to go, because that disconnection makes you feel like the only way you think is the right way, which is, we know is not true. So it takes away the fact that you can get from having to listen to different ideas or to understand people, but also that natural bonding that happens when you are just in the same space as someone else, that can lessen the stress response. When you look at bias and microaggressions and those factors, that our brain naturally is for us. Our brain wants us to win. Our brain is for our survival. So when we see somebody that may look different, it may be a different dialect, and maybe they have a hoodie, different color skin, all those things, our brain naturally suggests like danger, danger. But one of the easiest ways to minimize that is just to ask a question, to get curious, tell me about yourself, or say something, and that lowers the threat response. So it's all those factors that speak to why it's important to gather together, why it's important to be able to notice how people are doing, but also understand that, I am my brother's, my sister's keeper, has not changed. And in fact, we need it more and more. I saw an article recently that looked at the impact of AI and the danger of AI. It used to be that Google tracked like when they got you on, like how many places you went to doing research or reading based on something they said. And with AI, people are just satisfied to read whatever blurb that is, and they don't go any deeper to explore. So the danger is that we lose our curiosity. And because it's that curiosity that allows you to maybe look at something different or to get something that captures your interest, and what that's doing to our brain and what that also is doing to, again, our willingness to interact, and therefore and thereby things that shouldn't be a threat feel like a threat. And it really is about, how do we get more curious? How do we get less defensive? How do we understand that, I don't have to agree with you, but I still can learn from you. So like, talk to me. And it helps us. And so that disconnection can be self-imposed because, again, we're conflict averse. We don't want to hear it. But then, like, what am I missing in terms of a deeper way of thinking or the benefit of diversity, not just ethnically, but diverse ideas? And we know that when people are around and they have different experiences, different backgrounds, different multiple ways to solve a problem, then it helps everyone. All right. Any more questions? Thoughts? No. So, again, understand our brain is our biggest ally. And those factors that, your grandparents, or maybe your mom or dad taught you about, really paying attention how you sleep, what you eat, positive thinking, all those factors are there. Not to be afraid of our emotions. Our emotions can really be triggers that can help us look and point to what we need to go deeper, and to embrace emotions. Even anger, can be something that if you notice you're feeling angry, like literally ask yourself, like, what's going on here? And find ways to understand exactly what that is. Sometimes, anger may hide and be hiding sadness, or the same feeling for fear is out of excitement. So, again, what path do you want to take? To practice self-care, and self-care is not just going to the spa, getting your nails done. All those things are great, but self-care is making sure that you make your doctor's appointments, your mammogram, your pap smear, PSA, all of those things that you need to do. If you get bad news at the doctor, like, to go and follow up and understand what your options are. If you're someone that may have trouble, understanding that, or that you're somebody who lives in denial, to have somebody with you that you agree to, that's going to help keep you accountable. And then focusing on, what Dr. Merritt said, which is that sense of togetherness and connection, which is so critical, for our own growth and development, but also to really mitigate the stress response. And all of that begins and ends in our brain. And so paying attention to our brain health, our mental health, how we're doing, our mental wellness is really critical.
It is. Thank you so much, Dr. Taylor, for everything. We really appreciate how much you've enlightened us. Um, I'm excited. I might look for a therapist tonight.
Good. But no, thanks for the work that you do too. And just a reminder, like, if you're a patient navigator, a caregiver, like people, you're pouring out, people are pouring into you. So just be mindful of that balance, and take care of yourselves, like almost a superhuman desire to take care of yourself and prioritizing yourself. It's important. And as Audre Lorde said, self-care is not selfish, it's self-preservative, and that's an act of political warfare. So fight for yourselves.